A distant wail of sirens cut through the dawn air, mingling with the roar of angry voices as young protesters surged into Nairobi's streets. Smoke curled into the sky from burning tires, and the acrid sting of tear gas chased children from their doorsteps. In Mathare slum, a 12-year-old girl clutched her books as bullets splintered her window. Her only crime was trying to learn. Kenya is burning, the news said, but it was more than a headline. It was a nation's cry of desperation. On July 7, 2025, Saba Day, Gen Z students, jobless graduates, and mothers with infants joined hands against new taxes on bread fuel and mobile money. They weren't marching for party or tribe, they were marching for survival. Over 30 lives were lost by nightfall, more than 100 wounded, and nearly 500 people hauled into detention. When the Interior Ministry ordered shoot on sight, fear threatened to crush hope. Yet, through the haze of tear gas and the clang of batons, a chant rose. We are the last generation that will bow. But thousands of miles west beyond the dust of Nairobi, a different kind of rally was unfolding under the mango trees of Burkina Faso. There, Captain Ibrahim Traoré walked barefoot through village fields, handing out water tanks instead of riot shields. He spoke not of austerity and debt ceilings, but of land rights, solar pumps, and a new constitution born from the people themselves. Behind him, young farmers planted cassava. In makeshift cooperatives, artisans set up grain silos. No hashtags screamed for his removal, only a quiet promise. You made Africa poor, but it is not for sale. So when one nation rises in rage and another in resolve, a question echoes across the continent and beyond: who will lead Africa into the future? Will it be the leader who stands at a podium talking to distant creditors, or the one who kneels in the soil asking each villager's name? If this story has touched your heart, please hit like to show your support and subscribe to join us as we continue uncovering Africa's hidden currents. A low, urgent alarm broke the dawn's silence, its wail mingling with frantic shouts as teenagers in faded school uniforms raced through swirling clouds of yellow tear gas. The air tasted of panic and burnt rubber. The crack of batons hitting makeshift shields echoed off crumbling walls. This was Nairobi on July 7, 2025, Saba Day, when the city's youth rose together in a revolt that would forever stain Kenya's history. At first light, Gen Z students poured into the streets of 17 counties: Nairobi, Kisumu, Eldoret, Nakuru, and more, armed only with homemade shields and the resolve to protect their future. Word spread through urgent telegram messages and buzzing X feeds: meet at Uhuru Park at 8 a.m. Within hours, mothers with infants, jobless graduates in torn jeans, and even high schoolers fresh from exams converged on roundabouts and market squares. They carried placards that read, "No more taxes on bread fuel for our families, not for profit, and mobile money should free us, not feed debt." Their demands felt simple: roll back crushing taxes on basic staples. But for this generation, the protest was about more than money. It was about the right to learn without fear, to raise children without hunger, and to live without the shadow of bullets. As the sun climbed higher, police vans roared in deploying rows of riot officers clad in helmets and shields. An explosion of tear gas canisters silenced chants and sent children scrambling for cover in dusty alleys. By noon, the streets ran red with more than just anger. At least 30 lives were lost: men and women, mothers clutching infants, and young students who never saw evening light again. Over 100 protesters lay wounded, some bleeding through torn clothes, others carried away on the shoulders of comrades. Nearly 500 were arrested on charges of unlawful assembly, their futures uncertain as they sat in damp cells. One image captured the nation's heartbreak: a 12-year-old girl in Mathare slum, her bright eyes filled with terror, clutching her schoolbooks as a bullet splintered the window beside her. Her only crime: sitting too close to her studies. That photograph circulated worldwide, a stark reminder that even the innocent were not safe from the government's iron fist. The Interior Ministry's chilling order: shoot on sight anyone approaching police posts, gave officers license to treat streets like war zones. Yet even under a hail of rubber bullets, the youth refused to break. A rallying cry rose above the chaos: "We are the last generation that will bow." It echoed from Nairobi's central business district to the dusty lanes of Kisumu and the train tracks of Eldoret. Every chant was a promise, every step forward a defiance of fear. With state media either silent or muted, protesters became their own reporters. Telegram groups mapped police movements. Live streams from rooftops allowed families abroad to watch in horror and hope. Hashtags like Var Arto Must Go trended with over 4 million mentions in mere days. Videos showed young women using shields made from old road signs, praying in tight circles when tear gas closed in and coughing through streams of black smoke yet refusing to yield. Families huddled in dim living rooms, watching feeds on battered smartphones as the night brought curfews and more violence. In one late-night radio call-in show, a voice cracked through static, "Why are we taxing bread, but buying tear gas?" The question knotted the nation's grief and anger into a single thread of protest. Yet amid the fear, solidarity shone bright. Strangers offered water and first aid to the wounded. Retirees lowered shutters on their shops to usher young people inside. Even some officers moved by the courage of youth hesitated to fire. Rumors swirled of sergeants refusing orders of whispers in crowded barracks. These are our children, not enemies. By the end of that fateful day, Kenya was irrevocably changed. The streets bore the scars of conflict, but imprinted on every wall was a message of hope, a student's chalk drawing of a dove carrying bread, a simple slogan, "Our hunger is our power." This then was the stage for an epic question: when a generation stands up with nothing but determination, what can they achieve? A crescendo of chaos broke over Nairobi as dusk fell on the second day of protests. Under a blood-red sky, lines of riot, police advanced with shields locked together like a moving fortress. Their eyes were hidden behind visors. Their weapons stood ready. Over 5,000 rubber bullets and more than 1,200 canisters of tear gas had been deployed across the city in just 48 hours. By now, every street corner, every marketplace, and every roundabout had felt the sting of chemical smoke or the crack of an impact projectile. The true tipping point came with the leaked order from the Interior Ministry: shoot on sight anyone approaching police posts. That directive transformed the streets into a battleground. In Kibera, a farmer's son, barely 16, was cut down while fledgling peacekeepers tried to shield younger children. In Mombasa Road, a group of university students raising white flags were met with a fusillade of rubber bullets that shattered car windows and sent shrapnel whistling into residential compounds. Doctors in makeshift clinics counted at least 27 cases of skull fractures and eye injuries. The tally of gas-related respiratory distress topped 3,000 tongues. Yet it was the voices from inside the security apparatus that sent shockwaves through the nation. A clandestine audio recording emerged online, allegedly captured inside a Nairobi barracks. Over the hum of generators, a senior commander's voice echoes, "These are our children. This isn't security, this is politics. I won't have my men fire on mothers and students." Within hours, that clip was shared in WhatsApp groups and peppered across X feeds. The reaction was electric. Some officers reportedly laid down arms rather than obey the shoot-to-kill order. Rumors swirled of entire units refusing to deploy gas canisters. In the absence of clear leadership, battalions hesitated at the sight of unarmed marchers lowering their guns for brief, quiet moments of empathy. Outside the front lines, Kenyan civil society erupted. Lawyers filed emergency petitions demanding an immediate repeal of the shoot-on-sight mandate. Human rights organizations gathered data reporting daily casualty figures that often exceeded official counts. Social media activists turned hashtags into calls for international oversight. Janner and the siege trended in London and New York, while diaspora communities organized solidarity protests in Chicago's Hyde Park and Birmingham's Selly Oak. Emails flooded the U.S. ambassador's office, urging diplomatic pressure on President Artio's administration. Meanwhile, state-controlled broadcasters struggled to maintain a semblance of neutrality. Official bulletins acknowledged unfortunate incidents, but blamed troublemakers and foreign agitators. Independent journalists were detained or forced off the air. In one chilling broadcast interruption, a local TV anchor's feed froze. As she began to read a leaked military audit, viewers saw only static before the signal cut. In homes across Nairobi, families huddled around flickering screens, torn between fear and defiance. Grandparents whispered prayers for the young, mothers knitted scarves into makeshift tourniquets, fathers braced windows with wooden planks to protect against stray canisters. Dinner tables fell silent as news of the day's casualties was passed along like a solemn blessing. Yet amid the tragedy, moments of solidarity shone through. In Kisumu, a retired police sergeant opened the doors of his home to wounded protesters, offering tea and medical supplies. In Eldoret, a group of local elders organized protective human chains around schools, refusing to let officers fire on children leaving classrooms. The image of gray-haired men and women standing shoulder to shoulder with trembling students became a viral emblem of unity. Internationally, the reaction was swift. The African Union issued a statement unequivocally condemning excessive force and dispatched observers to Kenya. In Washington, congressional leaders called for a review of aid to Kenya's security forces. Major newspapers ran front-page editorials. The New York Times decried the erosion of civil liberties. The Washington Post warned of a turning point in East African democracy. Even in Paris, protesters gathered outside the French embassy demanding Europe leverage its economic ties to pressure for an end to bloodshed. Back on Kenyan streets, the protests' rhythm began to shift. No longer was it only about rolling back taxes, it had become a larger fight for accountability for the soul of the nation. Chants evolved from "No more taxes" to "Our lives matter" and "RTO, we will vote you out." Clinics, community centers, and faith groups formed human rights monitoring teams, documenting abuses and sharing satellite imagery of troop movements with international NGOs. As night deepened, a fragile ceasefire seemed to descend. Barricades of burning tires smoldered, yet in their glow faces shone with determination rather than defeat. The youth, bruised but unbowed, whispered among themselves, "We have seen bullets. Now they have seen our resolve." That unspoken understanding that the state could not quell a movement born of desperation and nurtured by empathy marked the climax of Kenya's uprising. In the wake of these events, the nation held its breath. Would President RTO respond with reform or further repression? And as Kenya grappled with its own turning point, a distant ripple was being felt across the continent, an echo of another path being forged under different skies. The dust of burning tires had barely settled when Kenya began to reckon with the fallout of its youth-led uprising. In neighborhoods still littered with spent tear gas canisters, civil society groups mobilized to fill the governance vacuum left by a shaken state. Community forums sprang up in church halls and market squares where lawyers, teachers, and elders debated calls for tax repeal alongside demands for truth commissions to investigate police violence. Grassroots organizations compiled people's reports documenting names and stories of the 30 confirmed dead and more than 3,000 injured. These reports circulated online and handed to sympathetic MPs fueled a swelling movement for accountability that went beyond simple fiscal grievances. Parliament, under pressure, convened an emergency session. Veteran legislators, many of whom had once marched for independence, listened as student representatives recounted tales of wounded classmates and shuttered schools. Heated exchanges followed. Some government ministers defended the Interior Ministry's hardline stance as necessary for order, while opposition leaders accused them of trampling constitutional rights. A cross-party parliamentary committee was established to review the shoot-on-sight order and propose reforms to policing powers. That committee's first draft called for mandatory body cameras on all riot officers and civilian oversight boards in each county, an unprecedented challenge to Kenya's security establishment. Meanwhile, the judicial branch took up petitions filed by human rights lawyers. In Nairobi's High Court, families of the slain argued that the state had violated basic protections of life and due process. Judges granted interim injunctions banning live ammunition against unarmed protesters and ordered the Interior Ministry to produce all directives related to the crackdown. Although the final rulings remained months away, these court actions signaled that Kenya's legal institutions were reawakening to their role as guardians of civil liberties. On the political front, the uprising reshaped the landscape ahead of the 2027 general election. Young voters disillusioned with traditional party lines formed new civic coalitions, registering tens of thousands of first-time voters. Local by-elections in protest-affected constituencies saw surprising victories for independent candidates campaigning on platforms of police reform and economic empowerment. Established parties scrambled to respond. One major party drafted a youth manifesto promising debt relief and universal internet access, while another announced plans to decentralize tax revenues directly to village councils. But the movement's momentum also revealed deep fissures. As the initial surge of solidarity faded, protesters faced movement fatigue, sustaining nightly vigils, and legal battles took a toll on already struggling families. Some organizations warned that without a clear long-term strategy, calls for no more taxes might fragment into parochial disputes over local budgets. Critics in Nairobi's business community decried the disruption to commerce, arguing that instability would deter investment and slow the economic recovery that Kenyans desperately needed. Half a world away, Burkina Faso's experiment under Captain Ibrahim Traoré entered its own critical phase. The swift implementation of land reform decrees and the Rural Development Bank's microloan program had brought tangible gains. Cassava yields climbed, village incomes rose, and small solar projects lit up rural schools. Political participation deepened as over 300 community councils elected their own spending committees. Yet these new institutions faced scrutiny. Journalists and NGOs pressed for transparent audits of cooperative finances and clear mechanisms for judicial review of military-led policy decisions. International creditors, once skeptical, took notice. The African Development Bank and a handful of Western donors quietly expressed interest in supporting scaled-up versions of Burkina Faso's community banking model. Negotiations began for concessional loans tied to performance metrics, crop yields, school attendance rates, and cooperative governance benchmarks. For Traoré's government, these talks offered both validation and risk. They risked entangling Burkina Faso in familiar cycles of conditionality, which he had loudly rejected. Within Burkina Faso's political class, debates flared over the role of the military in civilian governance. Opposition figures warned that entrusting soldiers with economic portfolios set a dangerous precedent. They demanded legal safeguards to ensure that local councils rather than regional commanders held budgetary authority. Traoré's allies countered that ordinary politicians had failed the villages for decades. A disciplined, mission-driven leadership was exactly what Burkina Faso needed. Across Africa and among diaspora communities in the United States, the juxtaposition of Kenya's protests and Burkina Faso's reforms sparked a broader conversation in churches, senior centers, and cultural associations. In Detroit, an elder at a community forum noted, "In Kenya, they rally against pain. In Burkina, they rally for a plan." In Brooklyn, a university discussion panel debated whether grassroots economic empowerment could outlast charismatic leadership. Africa news outlets amplified these debates, highlighting the question that had first been posed under Nairobi's tear gas: can protest movements transition into sustainable policy? As the civil and political aftershocks rippled outward, one thing became clear: both nations stood at a crossroads. Kenya's uprising had awakened institutions long dormant, demanding accountability and inclusive policymaking, but it also risked splintering without a unified vision for reconstruction. Burkina Faso's reforms had built promising alternatives from the ground up, yet they faced the perennial challenge of balancing military initiative with civilian oversight. In the end, Africa's future would likely be written not by a single strategy, but by the interplay of both the urgency of peaceful protest and the persistence of deliberate reform. And as you reflect on these divergent paths from Nairobi's curfews to Burkina Faso's council chambers, consider this: does real change come from the roar of the streets or the whisper of community halls? Across the Atlantic, Kenya's unrest and Burkina Faso's quiet revolution captured the attention of policymakers, media outlets, and diaspora communities alike. In Washington, D.C., congressional hearings on U.S. foreign assistance shifted focus overnight. Lawmakers who had long championed security partnerships with Nairobi now paused to question whether military aid was fueling repression rather than stability. Representatives from USAID briefed committees on the need to balance support for civil society with traditional security programs, while the State Department quietly convened experts to assess how grassroots economic models might complement governance reform across the Sahel. American think tanks offered contrasting analyses. At the Brookings Institution, scholars warned that protests without an onward policy roadmap risked spiraling into chaos, undermining Kenya's regional leadership. Meanwhile, at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, researchers held workshops on community banking as counterinsurgency, using Burkina Faso's Rural Development Bank as a case study in winning hearts and minds far from the battlefield. A flurry of memos circulated through National Security Council channels. Lessons from Gawa and Bobo Dioulasso were being considered for fragile states in West Africa, from Mali to Cameroon. U.S.-based NGOs mobilized quickly. CARE International and Mercy Corps dispatched rapid assessment teams to both countries, some to document human rights violations in Nairobi, others to support expanding cooperatives in Ouagadougou. Faith-based organizations tapped into church networks in Chicago, Detroit, and Atlanta, organizing fundraising drives for medical supplies in Kenya and microloan capital for Burkinabe farmers. In African-American congregations, elders drew parallels between Kenya's youth uprising and the civil rights sit-ins of the 1960s, while community gardens in Brooklyn planted cassava cuttings in solidarity with farmers 5,000 miles away. Global media coverage mirrored this split narrative. The New York Times ran a front-page feature on Kenya's broken promise, illustrating how economic frustrations had exploded into violence. Across the wire agents, France Press's Sahel correspondent filed reports on Captain Traoré's Sahel strategy, highlighting how local assemblies were rewriting resource deals. Even in Tokyo, Nikkei Asia published an op-ed charting investment opportunities in Burkina Faso's renewable energy sector, noting the ripple effects of solar microgrids seeded by Traoré's policies. For many Americans of African descent subscribing to Africa, news feeds became a daily ritual, alerting them to live streams from Nairobi's university forums or updates on new AES partnership agreements. The question on everyone's lips was the same one posed under Kenya's tear gas and Burkina Faso's mango trees. Can America's engagement evolve from security assistance to genuine partnership in community-led development? In the aftermath of Nairobi's tear gas clouds and Burkina Faso's sunlit fields, one lesson stands clear: change demands both the courage to confront and the patience to construct. Kenya's youth taught the world that when hunger and injustice push people to the brink, they will rise. Batons and bullets cannot silence a generation determined to protect its future. Yet without a plan to rebuild what was broken, protest alone risks fading into memory. Meanwhile, under Captain Ibrahim Traoré's steady hand, villages in Burkina Faso proved that community-driven reform can yield real results. From solar pumps to grain silos, from cooperative mines to local councils, ordinary citizens discovered that power shared is power sustained. But as critics remind us, even the most hopeful initiatives must guard against complacency and ensure that the voices of elders, women, and dissidents are never drowned out. So here is the warning. Movements born in anger must quickly find anchors in policy, and reforms born in strategy must remain rooted in accountability. The future of Africa will not be written by lone heroes, whether in polished suits or rubber sandals, but by societies that blend the fire of protest with the wisdom of planning. As you reflect on these two paths, Kenya's roar for justice and Burkina Faso's whisper of sovereignty, consider your role. Will you stand with those demanding change in the streets, or with those sowing the seeds of tomorrow's harvest? Perhaps both are needed. If you believe that true leadership listens before it speaks, that progress grows from the ground up, please leave a comment below. Share your thoughts. How should America and its allies support community-led development without repeating past mistakes? And if you found this story meaningful, hit like and subscribe so we can continue bringing you in-depth Africa news that goes beyond the headlines. Let's keep this conversation alive, and let's build a future worthy of our children's children.